On Valentine's Day, the U.S. Department of Education gave an ultimatum to schools and universities that receive federal funding. They must comply with federal law and stop what the Department of Education considers to be racial discrimination. This new guidance removes the practice of giving unique considerations to Black students, Latino students, and other underserved groups. Now, I wouldn't call this the ideal love letter to America's historically underrepresented students, but this is where we are. My name is Monica Maybank, and this is the Holy Politician Podcast. On this podcast, we discuss politics, policy, and culture through the lens of truth and holiness. If you have yet to subscribe, I would encourage you to do that now and share this video with your chat groups and at least 3 people that you know. So the U.S. Department of Education is a new U.S. Department of Education as of 30 days ago today. And the Civil Rights Office within the U.S. Department of Ed issued what is called a Dear Colleague letter on Valentine's Day. And it addresses the implications of the Supreme Court's 2023 decision on affirmative action. And that decision was Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard University. Now, you can read up on more up on this case if you want, but it basically got rid of affirmative action at America's colleges and universities. And this is something that has been super controversial for years, but affirmative action was in place for one very simple reason. And that reason is historically and disproportionately, Black students and other underserved students have been blocked and locked out of colleges and universities and some of the most elite colleges and universities in America. And affirmative action was meant to be in place to mitigate that problem. And so the Students for Fair Admissions case that I would encourage you to research and look into, it represented Asian students that argued that they were being discriminated against at Harvard in favor of Black, Hispanic, and other represented students of color, which I'm sure you've heard the term reverse discrimination before. So they argued that there was reverse discrimination happening against Asian students who they said were more than qualified to attend these institutions, but seats that they should have gotten were given to Black students, Hispanic students, and other underrepresented students of color. And so this new love letter, that I'll call it because it came out on Valentine's Day, it stresses that discrimination based on race, color, or national origin is illegal under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, as well as the Equal Protection Clause in the 14th Amendment, which I've talked about this for before. Equal protection is not the same as equitable protection, but most people are looking for equitable protection who have been historically discriminated against, but that's not protected under law. And so this letter specifically states, quote, "In recent years, American educational institutions have discriminated against students on the basis of race, including white and Asian students, many of whom come from disadvantaged backgrounds and low-income families. But what the letter fails to acknowledge or address is the affirmative action that is already taking place on many of America's college campuses. And this is something called legacy preference or legacy admissions." And so what's legacy admissions? I'm glad you asked. Legacy admissions is a college or university admissions practice where applicants receive preferential treatment if they have family members that attended the same institution. And usually this is if their parents or their grandparents went to this institution, that they get additional points on their application and additional preferences or special treatment. Does that sound familiar? For them to gain admissions and access to a university. So here's a quick explainer on legacy admissions.
Children of the super rich are more than twice as likely to get into America's most elite universities as middle-class students with the exact same test scores. This fast-tracks them to become the next generation of CEOs and lawmakers and helps keep wealth and power in the hands of people who started out wealthy and powerful. A big reason rich kids have such an advantage is so-called legacy admissions, the preference elite schools give to family members of alumni. The vast majority of Americans across the political spectrum think this is unfair. An astounding 68% of all voters support banning legacy admissions outright. This is the strongest bipartisan agreement I think I've ever seen on an issue that boils down to who gets special privileges in America.
Now, what this video goes on to explain is that in the top elite schools in America, less than 1% of Americans get into one of these schools. But their graduates account for 12% of CEOs in the Fortune 500. They account for 1/4 of all US senators, and then more than 1/3 of all Americans with a net worth over $100 million. These are the graduates of these top elite schools and the benefits of legacy preference. So if we're going to get rid of affirmative action, let's get rid of it in all of its forms. But until that happens, let's discuss how this new guidance from the Department of Education applies to both universities and the K-12 system. So how it applies to K-12 schools. Well, the letter reminds schools that any race-based policies of any kind, any programs, any special admissions practices or admissions preferences must comply with Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. So you might think about schools that are specifically set up to serve, for example, in Southeast Washington, D.C. There's a public charter school that is a boarding public charter school, and that historically has given preference to Black students who live in that community because it was created for Black students in that community that didn't have access to good schools. And so anything that is a race-based policy is not going to apply under this new guidance. This also includes race-based student assignments, scholarships, affinity groups. And affinity groups could be the Black Student Union on a high school campus, right? It could be the Latino Student Union. And so what the Department of Education is threatening is to withhold their funding for any public school that has affinity groups like this. And so how does it apply to college universities in a similar way? Higher education institutions can no longer give preferential treatment based on race. And that was already struck down in 2023 through the case Students for Fair Admissions against Harvard. Colleges must review their financial aid, their scholarship and hiring practices to ensure that they are not giving any preferences based on race. And programs that limit participation based on race or ethnicity, that they could potentially violate federal law. One of the things that I thought was interesting in the letter, the Dear Colleague letter, read it if you haven't gotten a chance to, is that the administration is saying that there are practices that are gross practices that take place on college campuses, such as separate graduations for certain races. Now, I've been to a Black graduation before. I went to an undergraduate institution that was historically Black, but when I went to a predominantly white institution, there was a separate Black graduation and there was a white graduation. I'm sorry, not a white graduation. There was the overall general graduation that took place that was predominantly whites that were in that graduation. Now, the Black graduation was meant to give us an opportunity to celebrate the successes of Blacks over time, who historically could not gain access to higher education institutions because, well, we were either enslaved or the country was negligent as it concerned our upward economic mobility. And so this is why HBCUs were created, right? Which is a form of affirmative action, if you think about it, because HBCUs were created specifically for Black students. Now, they are not supposed to discriminate against anyone who goes to an HBCU. There were some white people at my HBCU and people of other races and backgrounds. But if you think about how complicated this becomes, then what really is this guidance trying to accomplish or achieve with the language that they've used in this letter? So it's going to be really interesting to see how states make decisions, how localities make decisions about the implications of this letter for their students and from some of the special programming that they've had that really is meant to give people pride about their heritage and educate them about their heritage and empower them to move forward in life. Another thing that I think most Americans have a hard time digesting is that America In America, most decisions are based on race. And in many cases, those decisions discriminate against Black people because of a widely held and studied phenomenon called unconscious bias. And basically, unconscious bias is an automatic association that is expressed in your subconscious. You don't know that you're expressing it. And most people just haven't a clue. And so sometimes this is called a blind spot, right? So many people might say, oh, I'm not racist or I don't discriminate against any group or I'm colorblind. And they may mean it wholeheartedly in their heart of hearts. But then in the next breath, they may vote against moving a homeless shelter into their neighborhood because they don't want their kids to go to school with Black homeless kids. And this is something that actually happened in the District of Columbia where I used to live. And so you may have these good intentions and these kind of egalitarian views, but subconsciously, you may have some biases that are precluding you from supporting certain policies or practices that could benefit people who are historically underserved. So if we're not going to consider race at all in admissions, let's not consider race in admissions like we do with legacy admissions. So if you want to learn more about this Dear Colleague letter that came out on Valentine's Day, you can Google it and you'll find it. I would encourage you to continue to do your research, to scrutinize these things off of the lens of truth and holiness. And it's really important for you to do your own research and for you to pray and ask God, well, where do you stand on these issues? And there will be more to say on this in future episodes. I appreciate you joining and continue to pray for our country and stand in the gap for elected officials and people that have been put in places of influence, affluence, and authority because they need prayer just like anybody else. Please share this video, comment below. Don't forget to subscribe. Take care. God bless.